Marcus Chen wiped the grease from his hands and stared at the pile of scrap metal that had just been dumped in the station's junkyard. 15 years he had worked as a mechanic on Kepler Station, a small trading post floating at the edge of human space where nobody important ever came and nothing exciting ever happened. He had fixed thousands of ships in those years, from tiny personal shuttles to massive cargo haulers that carried goods between star systems. He knew machines the way other people knew their own families, and he could tell when something was special just by looking at it. The ship in front of him was covered in so much space dust and cosmic debris that he could barely see the hull underneath. It looked like it had been floating dead in space for thousands of years, collecting layers of grime and damage from micrometeorites that had slowly eaten away at its surface. The Valtteri merchant who had brought it in was a tall creature with purple tentacles and 3 eyes that blinked in sequence whenever he spoke. "Take it away," the alien said with a dismissive wave of his appendages. I found it drifting near the outer reaches and thought it might be worth something. But the salvage dealers say it is worthless junk with no functioning systems. Marcus walked closer to the ship and felt something strange in his chest, a kind of pulling sensation that he had never experienced before. The vessel was unlike anything in his memory, and he had seen ships from every major species in the galaxy. During his years at the station, the curves of the hull were wrong somehow. Not wrong in a bad way, but wrong in a way that suggested they had been designed by minds that thought very differently from anyone alive today. "How much do you want for it?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice casual, even though his heart was beating faster. The Valtteri laughed, a wet gurgling sound that humans found unpleasant, but that apparently indicated genuine amusement among his species. "You want this piece of garbage? I was going to pay someone to haul it to the recycling furnace. But if you want it, then give me 10 credits and it is yours." 10 credits was nothing, less than the cost of a meal at the station's cheapest food vendor. Marcus pulled a crumpled bill from his pocket and handed it to the merchant without hesitation. The Valtteri took the money and slithered away, still laughing about the foolish human who had just bought the most worthless ship in the sector. Marcus waited until the alien was gone before he approached the vessel and placed his palm against the cold metal of its hull. Up close he could see that the alloys were strange, metals that shimmered with colors he could not name and that felt somehow alive under his touch, even though all the ship's systems were clearly dead. He found the entry hatch after searching for 20 minutes, hidden beneath a layer of crud that he had to scrape away with a knife. The mechanism was frozen solid from millennia of neglect. But Marcus was a mechanic and frozen mechanisms were his specialty. He worked on it for 3 hours with every tool he owned until finally something clicked and the hatch swung open with a hiss of ancient air escaping into the station's atmosphere. The smell that came out was like nothing he had ever encountered, old but not rotten. More like the smell of a library that had been sealed for centuries. Marcus climbed inside and found himself in a corridor that was completely dark, except for the light from his flashlight. The walls were covered in symbols that he did not recognize, flowing patterns that seemed to move and shift in the beam of his light, even though he knew that was impossible. He made his way deeper into the ship, stepping over debris and ducking under collapsed panels, until he reached what had to be the bridge. The captain's chair sat in the center of the room, facing a massive view screen that was currently showing nothing but blackness. Marcus approached the main console and wiped away the thick layer of dust that covered its surface underneath. He found more of those strange symbols, arranged in patterns that made his eyes hurt if he looked at them too long. He pulled out his portable scanner and tried to get a reading on the ship's age and origin, but the device just flickered and displayed an error message. Unknown materials, unknown configuration. Unable to process, Marcus sat down in the captain's chair and felt a shiver run through his body. The chair fit him perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for someone his exact size and shape, which was impossible since no human had ever seen this ship before. He looked around the dark bridge and tried to imagine what kind of beings had built this vessel and where they had gone. The Galactic Registry had no record of any civilization that used this design, language, or these materials. The oldest known spacefaring species, the Velthari, had been traveling between stars for about 12,000 years. But this ship felt older than that. Much older. Marcus pulled up the salvage documentation on his tablet and read through the official assessment one more time. Non-functional derelict. Historical value negligible. Recommended disposition is recycling for base materials. He shook his head and laughed quietly to himself. Whoever had written that report had clearly not looked very closely at this ship. The technology here was not primitive. It was advanced beyond anything he had ever seen. Just dormant and waiting for something to wake it up. Marcus made a decision in that moment that would change his life forever. He would not report this find to anyone. He would not sell the ship or let anyone else examine it. He would figure out its secrets himself. No matter how long it took, he was a mechanic. And this was the most interesting machine he had ever encountered. The next morning, he filed for extended personal leave from his job at the station's repair dock. His supervisor, a grumpy old human named Patterson, approved the request without asking any questions. Marcus had not taken a vacation in 8 years and had accumulated more leave time than anyone else on staff. He moved his few possessions out of his tiny apartment and into the ancient ship for the next 6 months. The vessel would be his home, his workshop, and his obsession as he settled into the captain's chair that first night and looked around at the alien symbols covering every surface. Marcus felt a sense of purpose that he had not experienced in years. He did not know it yet, but he had just taken the first step on a journey that would make him the most powerful being in the galaxy, all because he had paid 10 credits for a ship that everyone else thought was worthless junk. 6 months passed and Marcus barely noticed the time flowing by. He had become completely absorbed in the mystery of the ancient ship, spending every waking hour tracing conduits and examining systems that operated on principles he did not understand. He stopped visiting the stations, common areas, and had his food delivered to the docking bay where his ship sat. Waiting, his former co-workers started calling him the crazy hermit who lived in the junk pile. But Marcus did not care what they thought. He was close to something. He could feel it in his bones. The ship's technology was far beyond anything that existed in the modern galaxy. But it was not magic. It followed rules and patterns. Just rules and patterns that nobody had seen for thousands of years. Marcus had filled 17 notebooks with diagrams and observations, slowly building a picture of how the vessel was supposed to function. The power systems were completely dead, drained of whatever energy had once flowed through them. He had tried connecting modern power sources to the ship's conduits, but the alien systems rejected everything he offered. It was like trying to fuel a starship with wood. The technology was simply incompatible. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning on an ordinary Tuesday when Marcus was working in one of the lower compartments. He was trying to remove a panel that seemed to be welded shut when his wrench slipped and sliced across his palm. Blood welled up from the wound and dripped onto what he had assumed was just decorative metalwork on the floor. The ship responded immediately. A deep humming sound filled the corridor and lights began to cascade through the walls in patterns that hurt his eyes to follow. Marcus stumbled backward in shock as the entire vessel seemed to come alive. Around him, the air grew warm and began to circulate through vents that had been sealed for millennia. Screens flickered to life on every surface. displaying information in that strange flowing script he had been studying for months. Then, the voice spoke inside his mind. It was not sound, exactly. More like concepts and images being placed directly into his thoughts. He saw a civilization of beings that looked almost human, but not quite. Tall and graceful with skin that shifted colors based on their emotions. He saw them building ships and stations and megastructures that spanned entire solar systems. He saw them spreading life across the galaxy, seeding barren worlds with the building blocks of evolution, and he saw them fighting desperately and hopelessly against something that came from the darkness. Between the stars, the voice told him that the ship's name was Eternity's Whisper, and that it had been waiting for 5,349 years for this exact moment. The precursors, as they called themselves, had known that their time was ending. They had won their war against the void creatures. But the cost had been everything they had built and everyone they loved in their final days. They had created a plan to ensure that their legacy would survive. They had seeded primitive worlds with genetic material, guiding the evolution of species that might one day grow to inherit what the precursors left behind. Humanity was one of those species. The voice explained that the precursor bloodline had been diluted over thousands of years of natural evolution, but certain humans still carried enough of the original genetic markers to activate their technology. Marcus was one of those humans. That was why he had felt drawn to the ship in the junkyard. That was why the captain's chair fit him perfectly. That was why the blood from his wound had awakened systems that had slumbered for 53 centuries. The ship bonded to him in that moment, its systems linking directly to his nervous system in a way that felt completely natural. Suddenly, Marcus could sense everything about the vessel. From the temperature in every compartment to the status of every system, he could feel the engines waiting to fire, and the weapons yearning to deploy, and the shields ready to protect him from any threat. More importantly, he could access the ship's database, a library of knowledge that made every university in the galaxy look like a child's collection of picture books. The precursors had recorded everything they knew about science and technology, and medicine and art. They had mapped the entire galaxy and cataloged every species they had encountered. They had developed solutions to problems that modern civilizations had not even discovered yet, and they had hidden their wealth, resources and holdings scattered across 10,000 worlds, waiting for their heir to claim them. Marcus sat in the captain's chair as the ship's artificial intelligence gently explained the scope of what he had inherited. The numbers were so large that they lost all meaning. He owned mining operations on worlds that the current galactic powers had not even explored yet. He held patents on technologies that would revolutionize every industry, controlled dormant factories and automated stations that could produce anything he needed. The total value of his inheritance exceeded the combined economic output of every known civilization by a factor that the I simply described as significant. Marcus laughed out loud at the absurdity of it. All yesterday, he had been a mechanic who lived paycheck to paycheck in a tiny apartment on a station that nobody cared about. Today, he was the wealthiest being in the history of the galaxy. The AI asked him what he wanted to do with his newfound power. Marcus thought about the question for a long time. He thought about all the broken things he had seen in his travels, the poverty and suffering and injustice that existed throughout civilized space. He thought about how the powerful species exploited the weak ones and how the rich corporations crushed anyone who threatened their profits. He thought about his parents who had died in a mining accident because the company they worked for was too cheap to maintain proper safety equipment. He was a mechanic. His whole life had been about fixing things that were broken, and right now, Looking at the galaxy with new eyes, he could see that almost everything was broken. "I want to fix it," he told the ship. "All of it." The AI seemed pleased with his answer. That, it said directly into his mind, is exactly what the precursors hoped you would say. Marcus smiled and placed his hands on the controls of his ancient vessel. It was time to show the galaxy what one human with the right tools could accomplish. The capital world of the Galactic Commonwealth was called Unity Prime, a planet covered entirely in cities and government buildings where representatives from 100 species gathered to argue about laws and trade agreements. The system was protected by the largest military fleet ever assembled. Thousands of warships designed to defend against any threat the galaxy could produce. Nobody had ever breached their security network. Nobody had ever jumped a ship directly into their restricted orbital zone without permission. Marcus Chun did. Both in the span of a heartbeat. One moment the sensors showed empty space, and the next moment eternity's whisper simply appeared as if it had always been there. Alarms screamed across every military installation in the system. 47 warships broke formation and surrounded the strange vessel within an hour. There, weapons locked and ready to fire, admirals shouted orders while politicians demanded explanations and intelligence officers scrambled to identify the intruder. The ship matched nothing in any database. Its design was wrong. Its materials were impossible, and its power signature was stronger than a small star. The Commonwealth flagship, a massive dreadnought called the Righteous Judgment, opened a communication channel and demanded that the unknown vessel identify itself. Immediately, Marcus took a deep breath and transmitted the precursor authentication codes that the ship's AI had taught him. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then every computer system in the fleet began to flash with confirmation signals. The codes were real, embedded in the foundational programming of galactic civilization itself. The precursors had not just disappeared 5,000 years ago. They had built the framework that every species now used for communication and navigation and government. They had written the original laws that the Commonwealth was based upon, and those laws clearly stated that anyone carrying valid precursor credentials held authority that superseded every other claim in the galaxy. The Senate chamber erupted into a chaos when the news arrived. Representatives shouted accusations at each other, while legal experts frantically searched through ancient texts for some way to challenge the authentication. The Velthari Consortium accused humanity of developing forbiddance weapons technology, the Krix hegemony. A warrior species that had been looking for an excuse to start a war began mobilizing their battle fleets. The corporate interests that actually controlled most of the galaxy's wealth started calculating how much they stood to lose. Marcus watched the panic unfold from his captain's chair and felt a strange sense of calm. He had expected this reaction. Power structures did not change easily, and he was threatening the biggest power structure the galaxy had ever known. He opened a channel to broadcast on every frequency and spoke in simple, clear words that left no room for misunderstanding. "My name is Marcus Chun, and I am a human from Kepler Station in the Outer Territories. 6 months ago, I purchased this ship from a Velthari salvage merchant for 10 credits. The ship is a precursor vessel, the last of its kind, and it has chosen me as its pilot and heir. I am not here to threaten anyone or demand anything. I am here to claim what is rightfully mine under the laws that you yourselves have been following for thousands of years." The galaxy held its breath. Ancient vaults on forgotten worlds began to open for the first time in millennia. Automated defense systems powered up and recognized Marcus as their legitimate commander. Hidden installations that had been waiting in silence suddenly came online and announced themselves to the network within a week. Financial analysts had calculated the approximate value of Marcus's inheritance. The number was so large that most people could not comprehend it. He now legally owned roughly 40% of all developed space in the galaxy, including resource deposits and manufacturing facilities and real estate that the current inhabitants had assumed belonged to them. He was not just wealthy. He was wealthier than every government and corporation combined. Within a month, people started calling him Emperor Marcus, hated the title, but he could not stop it from spreading. The common people of the galaxy, the workers and farmers and miners who had spent their lives struggling under the boot of the powerful, saw him as a symbol of hope, a regular person who had risen from nothing to challenge the entire established order. The powerful saw him as a threat to be eliminated. But first they had to figure out how to fight someone whose ship could appear anywhere in the galaxy without warning, and whose technology was thousands of years more advanced than anything they possessed. The first assassination attempt came 3 weeks after his broadcast. A team of elite Velthari commandos infiltrated the station, where Marcus was meeting with humanitarian organizations. They were highly trained killers, the best that money could buy, armed with weapons designed to penetrate any known armor. They got within 10 meters of Marcus before Eternity's whisper simply transported them away. The commandos found themselves floating in space in emergency survival pods. Completely unharmed but very confused, their weapons and equipment had been confiscated and replaced with food and water supplies. A recorded message from Marcus played on a loop inside each pod. "I am not your enemy, and I do not want to hurt anyone. Tell your employers that killing me is not possible, and that I would prefer to work with them rather than against them. The galaxy has enough problems without us fighting each other." The message made the news across every inhabited world. People who had grown up watching the powerful crush anyone who opposed them suddenly saw something different. A man with absolute power choosing mercy over violence. Some called him weak and said he would be destroyed by his own kindness. Others called him wise and said he understood something that the old powers had forgotten. The Krik's hegemony tested his defenses with a fleet of 200 warships. Marcus disabled every single vessel without destroying any of them, leaving the crews alive and the ships intact but completely powerless. He had their ships towed back to Krik space and released with a simple message: "I do not want war, and I will not start one. But I will defend myself, and I will protect those who cannot protect themselves. Choose your next actions carefully." The Kriks, a species that respected strength above all else, were divided on how to respond. Some wanted revenge while others argued that anyone who could defeat their entire fleet without killing a single warrior deserved respect rather than hatred. Meanwhile, Marcus began the real work he had come to do. He opened the precursor archives to medical researchers and watched as they discovered cures for diseases that had plagued the galaxy for centuries. He provided food synthesizer technology to colonies that had been starving under the neglect of their governments. He shared engineering knowledge that would allow smaller species to build their own ships instead of depending on the major powers. He was not building an empire. He was building something better, and slowly, grudgingly, the galaxy began to realize that this strange human mechanic might actually mean what he said. He wanted to fix things, all of them. 3 years had passed since Marcus first broadcast his message to the galaxy, and everything had changed while somehow staying exactly the same. The powerful still schemed and plotted. The wealthy still hoarded their resources. The corrupt still abused their positions. But now there was someone pushing back against all of it, and that someone refused to play by the old rules Marcus had established, what he called the Restoration, a program designed to share precursor technology with every species equally regardless of their status or wealth or political connections. No patents or licenses or fees, just solutions to problems that had been causing suffering for generations. Common people loved him, for Ida Minor, a distant colony, could now feed his family with food produced by synthesizers. That cost nothing to operate. A child born with a genetic disease could be cured by treatments that had been lost for 5,000 years. A small community could build their own power station using designs that Marcus had released to the public network, but every gift he gave made new enemies among the old powers. Corporations that had controlled food production saw their profits vanishing. The medical conglomerates that had charged fortunes for treatments watched their customers walk away. The governments that had maintained control through scarcity found their citizens no longer dependent on them. The assassination attempts continued. 17 in total over 3 years. Each one more sophisticated than the last. Marcus survived them all without killing anyone. The ship protected him with technology that made modern weapons look like toys. Assassins would find themselves transported to remote locations with supplies, and a message encouraging them to start new lives. Bombs would be teleported into space before they could detonate. Poison would be neutralized before it could touch his lips. His enemies called him lucky or claimed he was hiding behind his precursor technology like a coward. His supporters called him merciful and said he was showing the galaxy what true strength looked like. Marcus just felt tired most of the time. He had never wanted to be a leader or a symbol, or whatever the media was calling him this week. He wanted to fix things and then go back to his quiet life working on engines and solving mechanical puzzles. But every time he thought about walking away, he remembered the faces of the people he had helped. The mother who had wept when her daughter was cured of a disease that should have been fatal. The farmer who had thanked him for getting his village clean water for the first time in generations. The refugees who had found new homes on worlds that Marcus had opened for settlement. He could not abandon them. The Commonwealth Senate tried a different approach after the military failures. They declared Marcus an illegal entity, a rogue artificial intelligence pretending to be human, and claimed that his precursor codes were sophisticated forgeries. Was a desperate move that convinced nobody who mattered. Independent researchers had verified the authenticity of his credentials 100 times over, but the declaration gave the corporate interests legal cover to seize any assets they could reach. They took control of facilities that Marcus had been using to distribute supplies. They arrested workers who had been helping with the restoration. They blockaded worlds that had accepted his aid. Marcus responded by simply replacing everything. They took his automated factories, produced new facilities overnight. His ships broke through their blockades without firing a shot. His technology made their seizures meaningless because he could always create more. The corporations were fighting a war of attrition against someone with unlimited resources, and they were losing badly. The breaking point came when a coalition of the largest corporate entities pooled their resources to fund a mercenary fleet larger than most national militaries. 5,000 ships, crewed by the most ruthless fighters money could buy, armed with every weapon the black market could provide. They attacked a colony world that Marcus had been helping rebuild, a place called New Providence, where 500,000 refugees had finally found safety. The mercenaries broadcast their demands to the entire galaxy. Marcus would surrender himself and his ship within 24 hours, or they would begin destroying civilian targets. They expected him to negotiate or flee or sacrifice himself to save the innocent. Instead, Eternity's Whisper appeared in the middle of their formation and simply turned everything off. Every weapon system went dead. Every engine stopped functioning. Every computer displayed the same message: "You have threatened civilians who are under my protection. This is your only warning. Go home." The mercenary fleet drifted helplessly in space for 6 hours before Marcus had their ships towed to neutral territory and released. None of them had been killed or even injured, but the message was clear to everyone watching: the old ways of doing things, the violence and threats and exploitation, did not work anymore. New power existed in the galaxy, and it operated by different rules. The mercenary companies refused to take any more contracts targeting Marcus or his interests. The corporations realized that they could not win through force and began looking for other options. Governments that had opposed him started quietly approaching his representatives to discuss cooperation, and through it all, Marcus kept working. He established schools and hospitals and research centers. He funded exploration missions to find new worlds for overcrowded species, mediated disputes between rival factions who had been fighting for centuries. He did not call himself an emperor, and he refused to wear fancy clothes or sit on thrones or accept the ceremonial honors that people tried to give him. Wore the same simple work clothes he had always worn. He ate the same basic food he had grown up with. He spent his free time tinkering with machines and talking to ordinary people about their problems. His advisors, a group of representatives from dozens of species who had volunteered to help him manage his growing responsibilities, kept telling him that he needed to act more like a ruler. Marcus kept telling them that he was not a ruler. He was a mechanic who had stumbled into a very complicated repair job, and he was going to keep working until the job was done, no matter how long it took. 10 years had passed since Marcus Chun paid 10 credits for a ship that everyone thought was worthless junk. He stood on the observation deck of Eternity's Whisper and watched as a fleet of 200 vessels prepared to depart on the most important mission in galactic history. The ships came from every major species in the galaxy. Human and Veltari and Crix and dozens of others, all working together under a unified command structure that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. They were heading beyond the galactic rim into the dark void between island universes to begin building a defense network that would protect all life from a threat that most people still did not fully understand. The precursors had told Marcus their secret in the first moments of their bonding. They had not died in their ancient war against the void creatures. They had won, but only by sacrificing everything they had built to trap their enemies in a prison outside normal space. That prison was weakening. The void creatures were still alive, still hungry, still waiting for their chance to break free and consume the light of every star in the galaxy. The precursors had calculated that the prison would fail within a century of Marcus awakening their technology. That was why they had left the inheritance, not to create a wealthy emperor who would rule over lesser beings, but to create a guardian who would unite the fractured civilizations of the galaxy and prepare them for the battle to come. Marcus had spent 10 years building toward this moment. He had shared technology and resources to lift up species that had been struggling. He had mediated peace between ancient enemies who had finally realized they faced a common threat. He had established research programs to understand the void creatures and develop weapons that might actually hurt them. And most importantly, he had convinced the galaxy that cooperation was not weakness. The old powers had resisted him at first, but time and results had worn down their opposition. Even the Crix hegemony had eventually joined the alliance after Marcus personally saved one of their colony worlds from a natural disaster that their own technology could not handle. The warrior species had a simple code. You repaid your debts, and you stood with those who stood with you. Marcus had proven himself in their eyes, and that was enough. The fleet commander, a Veltari admiral named Thiessen, who had once been assigned to assassinate Marcus, signaled that all ships were ready for departure. It was a strange universe, Marcus thought, where your former enemies became your most trusted allies. He opened a channel to address the fleet and found himself thinking about how far he had come from that lonely repair bay on Kepler Station. Today, we take the first step on a journey that will define the future of every living being in this galaxy, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. The precursors gave us a warning and a gift. They told us that darkness is coming, and they gave us the tools to fight it. But tools are not enough. What matters is what we build with those tools and who we become in the process. 10 years ago, we were divided by fear and greed, and old hatreds that nobody could even remember the origins of. Today we stand together as one civilization. Not because I forced you to, but because you chose to. That is what will save us. Not my ship or my technology or my resources. You, all of you, working together towards something greater than any single species could achieve alone. Go now, and begin building our future. I will be right behind you." The fleet engaged their engines and vanished into the darkness beyond the galactic rim, carrying the first seeds of a defensive network that would eventually span the void between galaxies. Marcus watched them go and felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find the Velthary merchant who had sold him the ship all those years ago. Standing beside him, Korvax had been tracked down 3 years after the awakening and offered a job managing logistics for the restoration. He had accepted partly out of curiosity and partly because Marcus had offered him a salary larger than most planetary governors earned. Now he ran the largest supply operation in known space and still complained constantly about the worst deal he had ever made. "You know," Korvax said with a gurgling laugh, "I calculate the value of that ship at least once a month. The number keeps getting bigger, and it never stops making me feel sick." Marcus smiled at his old acquaintance. "Would you like me to give you back your 10 credits? Do not mock me." "Human," Korvax replied with all 3 eyes narrowing in what Marcus had learned was mock offense. Some wounds never heal. They stood together in comfortable silence and watched the stars for a while behind them. The war room hummed with activity as representatives from 100 species coordinated. The largest construction project the galaxy had ever attempted. Former enemies sat side by side, arguing about supply chains and deployment schedules and engineering specifications. It was chaotic and inefficient, and sometimes frustrating beyond belief. It was also the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen. The ship's eyes spoke into his mind with the gentle voice that had guided him through so many difficult years. Was it worth it? It asked. "The burden you have carried all this time." Marcus thought about the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. He thought about the sleepless nights and the assassination attempts and the constant pressure of being responsible for so many lives. He thought about the loneliness of being different from everyone around him and the weight of knowing that the fate of the galaxy rested partly on his shoulders. Then he thought about a girl he had met last week on a colony world that the restoration had helped rebuild. She had been born with a condition that would have killed her before her 5th birthday, if not for precursor medical technology. She was 7 now, healthy and happy and full of dreams about becoming a starship pilot. She had shown Marcus her drawings, pictures of ships and aliens and adventures among the stars, pictures of a future she believed in because someone had given her a chance to live every credit. Marcus said aloud, answering both the AI and himself. He looked out at the galaxy he had sworn to protect, the billions of worlds and trillions of lives that were counting on him to keep his promises. There was still so much work to do. The void creatures were still out there, waiting and hungry. The defensive network would take decades to complete. Old prejudices and conflicts still flared up despite all the progress they had made. The galaxy was far from perfect and probably always would be, but it was better than it had been 10 years ago. It would be better still 10 years from now. That was enough. That was what it meant to be a mechanic. You did not expect perfection. You just kept working, kept fixing, kept making things a little bit better than you found them. Marcus turned away from the observation window and walked back toward the bridge of his ancient ship. The Velthary merchant fell into step beside him, already complaining about a supply shortage in the outer sectors. Somewhere in the war room, a Krix general and a human scientist were arguing about shield frequencies. Life continued, messy and complicated and full of problems that needed solving. The mechanic who had become an emperor rolled up his sleeves and got back to work. There was still so much to fix, and he would not stop until the job was done.